Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about using data to drive better sourcing decisions, and it's going to be a little strange, so I'm going to go through a couple of PowerPoints here and then the computer connections in the back, and then I'll demo the new solution in the back. But before we get into that, I think there's probably a couple of new faces in the room that may or may not be familiar with sourcing management and Alemica. So in our sourcing business, we handle the source to contract process, so anything that would be in e-sourcing. We've launched the new solution, which is sourcing optimization. We also have master data management, spend analytics. So all of those encompass sort of the source to pay process, or source to contract process, and then the procure to pay is supplier management of Alemica, and that's Omar in that place. So we've done 17,000 sourcing events, and these are actually numbers, these are at the end of last year. 17,000 sourcing events, $28 billion in spend, and across those average 8% of savings. And so that's from all commodity types, and from the raw materials that we help some of our customers source, to logistics, to all the indirect materials as well. And there's 14 categories where we've sourced over 100 times. So for certain categories, we really do have a lot of commodity experience for those categories. And then one of the things that I think is different about Alemica than a lot of other service providers in this area is the number of aggregation events we do. So we'll go to market on cell phone aggregation. Alston ran one last year where we've essentially aggregated wireless for 12 customers, essentially to sort of leverage where we can indirect materials. So we do cell phones is a place we've done rental cars. In Europe, we do gas and utilities and electricity. So some of those are different depending on the region of the world you're in. So real quick before we get into the demo, I want to just provide a couple of context slides. So this is actually the founder of Yahoo, who said, there's a huge opportunity for us to make better decisions and essentially using the data that we have. And so how do we do that? And companies like Walmart and P&G, Amazon, Yahoo, they've all been using big data since before big data really existed. And so how do we, as sourcing people, start to leverage the data that we have and use it in a better way? And we talk about specific data challenges in sourcing. And as the supply chain has gotten more complex, so has sourcing it. So if we look at a couple of projects that we're doing right now, one is for pipes, valves, and fittings for a chemical company. And we're looking at approximately 6,000 parts across 7 different plant sites. 30 different suppliers are bidding. They're bidding primary parts as well as alternate manufacturers. And when we look at all of that data, that project I just described is about 500,000 data points. And so really quickly you get to a point where Excel fails, Ariba. We use Ariba for some more standard purchasing. And all of those sort of basic tools really start to fail when the data points are very high. And as purchasing people, we know the more value and the more savings you deliver one year, the next year they usually just ask you to have more savings because that's what we do in purchasing. So I think that, as we look at our more mature sourcing organizations, most of those organizations have year over year, through purchase price variance and then total cost of ownership, have bid the same commodities and really squeezed as much savings as they can out of the process. And so what we're looking at and this study from Aberdeen shows, is that really the next frontier of sourcing opportunity and value creation is really from looking at it from an end-to-end value chain perspective. And so the 3 areas here, and this is from a 2012 study, I think, so it's a few years old, but companies are starting to look at predictive analytics. How do we, take the data that we have from an analytical perspective and use it for sourcing projects? How do we optimize suppliers? Supply risk assessment. This is a big one, and when I go through the demo, one of the things we look at for optimization is if we're making a particular decision on the number of suppliers or the network that we're using to supply our materials, what if a catastrophic event happens like or a port congestion or an earthquake somewhere. What the software actually can do now is, from a sourcing perspective, I can take that plant out or that location out and I can re-optimize and then very, very quickly see, it might not tell me exactly what that capacity is today because that's going to change from a supplier perspective, but really quickly I can see where are sort of the first triage points for me. So I'm going to go through 2 examples and then I'll jump into the demo. And these are really to illustrate, before we get into how the solution looks, because sometimes you need the 50,000 foot view before you can get down to the lower level, is how does optimization work? So the multi-objective decision making essentially says as procurement people, a lot of what we do, a lot of the decisions we make are around the cost of the product or total landed cost. But there are other scenarios in which case that provide constraints, essentially business constraints that we're making decisions on. And so if we're a purchasing person and I'm looking at the supplier bids that I have for the 5 products, I would look at supplier 1 and say, if there's no business constraints, I would probably award all that business to the first supplier. But what if none of the suppliers really have capacity to fulfill demand? Oops, sorry, this one went fast. What if they can only fill the maximum of 3 products? And what if 2 of the suppliers give us a discount? Then it becomes really hard, just in this state, to do that necessarily math in your head, and then also on a spreadsheet. Imagine when the number of products is not 5, it's 5,000, and the number of suppliers is 3, it's 30. And you're looking at the networks across various different plants. And then really the decision is what appears to be your highest cost decision once you start layering on those business constraints. And here are a couple simple examples regarding capacity and discounting. But very clearly you can see that the choices that you thought were the best choices, once you layer on your business constraints, that really changes. And how to quantify those, and how, as you go through the sourcing process, all those trade-offs happen between cost and service. The next one is something that we're using a solution for, is being able to optimize across the entire supply chain. So this is an inbound example where you're going to market on raw materials at the same time as you're asking your carriers for logistics. And instead of bidding necessarily from a static standpoint to say these are the routes that I'm automatically going to use to bring those materials inbound, we're really allowing the carriers to be more flexible. And we're using the production demand that we have for all of our plant locations to really pull the material through the supply chain and logistics process. And so we might go out to market saying we know what those flows are going to be, the material flows, but when we look at all of those things in concert together, what essentially looked like a good idea or a good flow yesterday might be actually different once we look at the constraints that we have from a supplier perspective as well as a logistics perspective. And so the solution that I'm going to take you through today is really geared toward looking at the entire network holistically and not just from a pricing standpoint. All right, so I'll go into the demo. And I'll try to do this rather quickly because I think we're a little behind.
So this is Alamica's new sourcing optimization solution. You'll see really quickly when we look at just a high-level overview of all the parts of the system that a lot of the parts of the system that you would see customarily in an e-sourcing application are located in this application as well. So the bidder management, project management, the communication and messaging pieces, of course the bidder management as well. So you can see that a lot of them are the same. I would point to the 3 parts of the demonstration that we'll go through today, really focus on where the power of this solution is relative to other e-sourcing solutions in the market today and optimization solutions. So really the focus of what I'll go through the demonstration today is on what's most important in terms of flexibility and robust analytics in this solution and our solution versus any other solution that's out there on the market. And really we'll find that in a couple of different areas. One is the RFX definitions, so the flexibility in the system, and I'll show you that in a second in terms of what a bid template looks like. The analytics and scenario management piece, and then reporting as well, which you'll see in the analytics. So looking at this is an overview of an ocean bid, and you'll see here that there are, this is sort of the main entry page that provides sort of quick links into analysis and contract management notifications, as well as understanding who else is on the project with you. These are internal project management personnel, as well as bidder accounts and any sort of tasks that you have to do or frequently asked questions. So if there's a notification from a bidder asking a question about a particular part of the RFQ or RFP, it will come through in the frequently asked questions piece. You'll also see a timeline here. And the timeline is really several phases. In this example, we have 3 rounds of bidding, and that just sort of gives you a quick visual project layout of when the project started, when it's ended, and what phase of the project you're in today. And you'll also see down here, there's some information about each particular round of the project, how many bids are included in those projects, the number of organizations that bid in those rounds, and so on and so forth. So that's just a quick orientation to the overview, the project overview page. If we get into, like, as I mentioned, where the real power of the system is, it's really in the structure and flexibility of the bid template, and so most of the projects that are done for sourcing optimization have a very large amount of data, and as a result of that, a lot of the projects that we run are going to be, we're going to capture most of those bids through an Excel format. There isn't the ability to capture them online, and we can do that if we need to, but because of the vast amount of the data, the most efficient way to gather it is really via Excel. And so you'll see here where we've got the, all of the columns labeled in terms of the information that we're sending to the bidders, and then the other sections represent the parts of the bids that are going to be filled in by the bidders. Really, the most important thing here is to note that this is completely a flexible template. So, like a lot of our other competitors, most of those solutions are hard-coded. The columns are hard-coded in those solutions, and so it's often difficult to adjust the solution to exactly what you need it to be. So, for example, in our solution, we can move pieces of the bid around if we decide that we want, destination in front of origin. We can. But really, that's a different amount of flexibility than you see to the bid sheet. The other thing that the system will allow you to do is collect sort of primary bids, if you will, and additional single bids. And then also bid supplements. For instance, if you have capacity or, in this case, equipment constraints, those can be entered here as well. We're actually running a bid right now where we've done, and not an ocean bid, but MRO bid, where we have put out 3,000 line items of MRO parts, and we've also have the primary manufacturers that are approved for those parts, and then we have alternate manufacturers which are not approved by our client. And what we've done in that case is the single bids have been for the primary parts, but then we've also captured additional bids, and this is an example of where a bidder would put in the additional bids. We've also captured additional bids for that same information. So, and then we're able later on to optimize and make scenarios on whether or not a part is awardable, from an approved source, or if there's potentially additional savings that are available from that approved source or from a non-approved source, then we can factor that into the analysis as well. So this is essentially the flexibility of how do we develop a very flexible bid template. One of the other areas that we'll go into is, there's questionnaire management. So typically this will be your RFI questionnaires. There's also bid supplements. So bid supplements allow us to capture, again, whether it's capacity data, essentially other data external to the actual bid that you would use in analyzing the bid. So a good example of that for ocean is, lane capacity constraints, trade lane, discounts, that sort of information. For parts or materials and raw materials, we see a lot of the bid supplements taking on the sort of approval, whether the quality approval levels or quality levels. Fact sheets are another area that's very interesting in the solution compared to other solutions that are available out there, in that any data that you have externally that could be used in an event could be loaded as a fact sheet and then used later on. So for instance, long term, what I see as far as fact sheets from Alemica is that we'll be able to load in our transactional data from our network into the fact sheets, scrub them in the fact sheets. There's some data cleansing functionality in the fact sheets, and then be able to move from that transactional data, cleanse data, normalize, and move directly into the sourcing event, so that for our customers, they're able to pull that information directly from the network. If we look at the other sort of pieces of the system that I wanted to demo today, to really provide a feel of what the analytics are, I want to go into the analysis portion. And this is just the scenarios tab that will essentially, it's the what if scenario that you're trying to achieve. So for instance, a lot of baseline sourcing events, typically the first scenario that you might look to is a cherry pick scenario, but where you would understand what your lowest costs are, holding no other variables. And then what you do is you sort of layer on constraints, business constraints, if you will, that allow you to determine what the best scenario is based on, let's say your plant constraints or transportation constraints, other business constraints that exist. So I'll just go into one of the examples here and show you how we construct a scenario or a new rule, let's say. So in this case, we have obviously some pre-built scenarios here, but I will go ahead and start a new rule. And let's say this one is allocate at least 50% to incumbents. And so how we build constraints in the system, first to talk about a little bit about the constraints that are available in the system. Our current solution that we're actually in the process of sunsetting has about 15 constraints that are available. The new solution has over 100 constraints. And so you'll see there's a lot of general constraints in terms of, the winners is at most, the winners is at least, the allocation. So how much of those allocated units, let's say, or parts are in a particular award scenario. You can limit by bid priority. So in the example I gave earlier where there's primary parts and alternate parts, you can have a bid priority where you always prioritize the primary parts ahead of the alternate parts, but if a primary manufacturer match doesn't exist, then you can look at the alternative sources, for example. You can favor or penalize bids. We see this a lot, for instance, in ocean, in terms of the transportation service levels, where if you have a very consistent carrier that provides, transportation or the transit time is 22 days, let's say, and they have a very high service level, service confidence level, then you may choose to favor those, the lanes in which those carriers provide high levels of service. You may tend to penalize other areas where they've provided low levels of service. So that's, there's flexibility in the system to handle that. There's also, additional, and I won't go through all of these, but discounts, so the ability to provide different discount structures, incumbent allocations and incumbent units, which is actually one that we'll leave today. And there's also other different rules that you can go through at any given time. Again, it's very focused. The whole point of the system is to be very focused on flexibility and to allow you to configure the business constraints that you have in your business as you're going through those award scenarios so that you can most closely mimic the award scenarios to what's actually happening in your business. So in this case, we'll go to allocation to incumbents is at least. And excuse me, we'll put it's at least 50%. And we're going to look at repeating for every, so we're going to look at allocation is 50% to incumbents when, let's say, those, let's say destination country, in areas where the destination country is equal to Brazil and the US, let's say. And really that's sort of how easy it is to build constraints, and they read somewhat like a sentence. So the allocation to incumbents is at least 50% for every destination country where the destination country is equal to Brazil and the United States. So we'll go ahead and save this. And we will solve, okay. So you'll see how quickly that report solved. And we'll go ahead and generate the main report here. And then I can open the report, and you can see very, very quickly, this gives me a summary of what the that scenario had. And so as we look through the scenario analytics, and this is really the sort of built-in analytics that are in the system, this provides you a summary, obviously the project, the scenario name, so which scenario it is, the number of lots that are were in the event, the number of lots that had bids, the number of bidders, the number of bids that were captured, and you can see the number of allocated units and so on and so forth. And we look at, I'll take you through some of these tabs. You can also look lot by lot. So these are lanes, how many bidders are on that particular lane, what is the highest cost for that lane, what is the lowest cost for that lane, and you can see the savings that are on that particular lane, the number of suppliers. You'll also be able to see the highest supplier, the lowest supplier, so that you can really very quickly in each scenario get to the information and the analytics that you're looking for, particularly when you're starting to look through incumbents. How did the incumbent perform? And again, this is another view here where we have the number of bids per lane, the lowest bidder, the second lowest bidder, the highest bidder, what the average number of bidders are, and then also for each bidders, the distance that they are to the lowest price. So this is helpful when you look at how competitive, these are very competitive lanes where you've got 3 or 4 or 5 bidders in particular, and then you'll see other lanes where there's just a single bidder for that lane, and so obviously you have less leverage in that place. It also provides bids that are missing historic pricing. So this is essentially cases where demo bidder 8, for example, is the incumbent for this lane and did not bid. So that provides you just a really quick glimpse at how many incumbent suppliers have not provided pricing against those incumbent lanes. Again, you can look at how those bidders have performed across each of all of their bids. So for demo bidder 1, you'll see we have the number of lots they bid, how effective their bidding has been from the lowest rate per unit, as well as how do they place among competitively. So where you can see, they have very few lots, let's say of the 163 parts they bid, lanes they bid, 33 of those, they're within 5% of the lowest bidder. 51 of those are within 10% of the lowest bidder. So you can really quickly see how aggressively the carriers are bidding in this case. You can also see, bidders that don't have any bids, and obviously there's some examples here. And there's some additional tabs that we'll go to in terms of packages and other bids that apply. So really, the point of that is that you have a lot of out-of-the-box functionality and analytics that you can package around any of these particular scenarios. So when we go back to the solution and we look at all of the different scenarios, those kind of analytics are out of the box with any of these So that's really out-of-the-box reporting that exists in the solution that you can do for any one of the scenarios. You also have the ability to customize that out-of-the-box reporting. So the file that I just went through, there are a couple of tabs in there that we typically don't use in our analytics, and we've pulled those out of our custom reports. So essentially, you can customize those reports and template them in the system and use them project to project to essentially make sure that the analytics that you're reporting on for each scenario is what you really want the data to be. And I'll go through a couple of just quick reports. So for any scenario that we have here, we also have the ability to do very quick reporting off of those. So you'll see we can generate reports, and these are reports that we've created, and we can create them in Excel. We can create sort of grid charts, which are Tableau-like, and I'll show you one of those in a second. And we can also look at Google Earth, which I'll get to later. So in this case, we can report against the bid analytics. So we have the ability to report off of just the bids that the suppliers have provided. We can report off of the bid analysis. And so that really is, the scenario analysis, and that really is what we were just looking at, where we've layered on the business constraints to those bids to come up with what the optimal solution is for our particular company. And then the bid bank, you'll see that when we report, we can report against any phase. So we can, in this case, we'll report against RFQ phase 1, and this is the bid analysis. But we also have the ability to report against the bid bank, and the bid bank is any report that has come through in any one of the phases or rounds of bidding. We can go ahead and report on that as well. So I'll just go into one of the grid charts here. This is, so you always have the ability to download, in Excel the report, and this is an example of this one. But you also have the ability to look at just online and drill down into the kind of information you want. So, for example, this one is the number of winners per phase in terms of allocation, and you can drill down, and we're comparing here the cherry pick scenario versus the sample scenario, and you can also change those charts, flexibly. So if you wanted it to be a bar chart, let's say a line chart, a pie chart, essentially, and you can really look at. You can also navigate up and down into those different areas. So to click down, you can just look at what does my cherry pick scenario look like, and then this is, how does it break up per origin country code, and you can drill down again into the bidder level. So there are other ways. This is sort of a quick interface that allows you, it's very Tableau-like, that allows you to sort of drill down into information real time, but it also is flexible in that you can do things very, very quickly and provide high-level snapshots. There's also the ability to print the chart as well as download it in any image, so that if you're putting them into PowerPoint for a presentation, it's pretty quick to move through those phases. I'll cancel out of that. And then the final one is really the Google Earth allocations. And so what we do here, we do this a lot, mostly on the logistics bids, is really looking at how does the network look just in Google Earth. And so it's interesting sometimes to look at the awards and the scenarios that you're looking at and how they map out in different regions. And so this is essentially taking those scenarios that we were looking at before and plotting those in the different regions so we can see where, in this case, where material movements are happening. And so you can drill down into very, very detailed information. You can also hover, and you'll see, this one is set up to where this particular lane is going, from Galve to Durban, as an example. If we look at this one, so it's going from Saudi Arabia to India or Italy, and so really, it just provides a good visual representation of where the material movements are, and also helps, particularly sort of in risk analysis. It's just a good visual representation to look at how, where is the bulk of our movements. Are there particular risk areas we have? For instance, if there's an earthquake in South America or on the Pacific Rim, let's say, and we can see where those epicenters are as far as our material movements. So really, that covers most of the areas that I wanted to go through in the solution, to just provide an overview of where we feel the strongest parts of our solution are. Of course, it does all the basic information and the basic bidding that you would see in any sort of general e-sourcing solution. But from an optimization standpoint, it's very, very powerful, highly configurable, and allows you to really spend less of your time doing analytics and more of your time working on the strategy work.